All right, guys, welcome to another podcast. This week, we are going to dive deep into some very, very interesting information that I have been researching for many years myself, been aware of, but I've noticed there's so many people around the world that actually are kind of missing this very, very important information that it just gets missed. And there's a lot of reasons to that. In fact, that's part of the way these entities have been able to push their propaganda and their misinformation is because they actually hide behind misinformation. And so that's what we'll be talking about today with one of the top experts on this subject. Izabella is a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism. She is a senior fellow with the Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities and a contributing writer at Tablet. Follow her on X, and we will have that in the description of the podcast, guys. So look down the description. I'll show you the X link that you can go to and follow her research there. Lots of good information on her X profile. You can find most of her articles on this subject and more. So, Izabella, it is wonderful to have you on the podcast. I'm so happy you were able to make this happen. And
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Why don't you give the audience here a little background about yourself, who you are, and then we can dive into the subject.
Sure. So again, thank you so much for having me. I grew up in the USSR, went to the US in 1989, and I was already 19 then. And I'm not embarrassed to disclose my age because I always want people to understand that I actually know from not only from research, but also from personal experience what it is that I'm talking about. So I lived in the US for 30 years, a little bit more than 30 years. Now I live in Jerusalem, made Aliyah about 5 years ago. And some years ago, I think in 2017 or 18. Well, let me actually backtrack a little bit. So we moved to the U.S. as most Jewish families at that time, as the USSR was falling apart. But we moved because of the anti-Semitism in the society, and we had experienced it and had trouble. I had trouble getting into a college I wanted to get into. My family had trouble throughout their professional careers because of being Jewish. And when we moved to the US, I sort of forgot all about it. I never experienced a day of anti Semitism in my life until around 2018. And that's when I first, and I tell this story pretty much in every lecture, so I apologize to those who've already heard it, but I think it's really important. So in 2018 or so, I saw a news item on TV, which showed the kind of demonstration on a campus that I think is very common today, but at that time it was just shocking. It was a bunch of people with signs: Zionism is racism, and Israel is whatever, settler colonial state. And they were also saying that they're not being anti-Semitic; they're just being anti-Zionist. Mm-hmm. And that sort of triggered something in my mind, something long forgotten that I couldn't quite place my finger on. And I called my dad and told him about it. And I said, look, they're doing all these things. They're saying all these things. And I'm so confused why this is an American campus. And they're also saying that they're just being anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic. And my dad just laughed and said, oh, yes, we've heard this one before. Mm. And I thought, yes, exactly. We've heard this before. And that sort of set up this really a nearly an obsessive desire to understand why was this language suddenly here? Because it was language, all this anti-Israel, anti-Zionist language, we had heard it back in the USSR in the 70s and 80s. And so I had a question. I had several questions. I was like, first of all, I wanted to understand what it was that we had experienced back then, because, sometimes just because you experience it doesn't mean you had thought it through. So I wanted to understand it better. And also what was clear to me was that you don't just reinvent this kind of language from scratch. As the more I looked at what the left was saying about Israel, the more I understood that it was really an incredible it just matched Soviet propaganda from those years,
Mm.
tropes, motifs, explanatory logic, kind of the entire worldview. And I was like, well, you don't just reinvent that; it's impossible. So some transmission must have occurred somewhere. And so I started investigating that as well and looking into, what were the connections between the global left and the Soviets in those years? Were they, for example, left wing publications, far left publications in the UK, in the US, that we know to have been financed by the Soviets? Were they publishing this stuff then? Just to understand, because obviously, if you got money from the USSR and you're publishing this stuff, it means that there is an editorial control there. So this is what I've been doing for the last, I guess, 8 years. Although it feels like I've been doing it all my life.
Well, you've definitely experienced it for a good portion of your life, and
Right, right,
like you were mentioning that it had been like what, about a 30-year gap between um, when you left and experienced that last, right?
right.
And then here you are many years later, and you've been living in the United States, where you don't have that same weight of anti-Semitism, at least not when you move to the States. And this is something that I've seen that has been increasing in the past, I don't know, let's say 10 years, give or take, kind of becoming more and more in your face. Before that, it was just behind the scenes, and you really had to look really hard to see it. And I remember what first got my attention to this communist, Marxist kind of, how would you say, behind the scenes um, breakdown of American society, of Christian values. Like, I noticed they're targeting specific things. It's the faith, it's the family structure, it's the things that based on my research is what made America strong in the Soviets' eyes.
Yeah.
And if we can demoralize them, destroy them from within, we won't even have to fire a shot. They're gonna eat themselves out.
Yes.
And
Well,
and so when I
mhm.
saw that, it really troubled me that whoa, there's a, like, this is an actual plan. I thought the Cold War was over, right? Because that's what a lot of Americans have been told. Hey, Cold War's over. We're all good. It's like a multifaceted of both that, and it has a very strong anti-Semitic slant, but it comes in such ways that it's very hard to piece together, right? To connect the dots, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. And well, in terms of who propagates it, I mean, I think that certainly in the during the Cold War time, for sure, the Soviets very much had an understanding. That term you use, demoralization, that very much was part of the internal understanding that you can undermine and demoralize a society without, as you say, without firing a single shot. And what does it mean really to demoralize a society? It really means, like many people, and maybe some of your viewers and listeners also have seen the talks by Yuri Bezmenov, who is a defector, KGB, a KGB defector, and he talks a lot about demoralization. He defected in the I think in the 70s, and then started
Mhm.
giving talks in the early 80s. But I when I first saw it, and this was a few years ago, I thought, okay, well, this makes sense, but I don't know. I think he's just perhaps, he's deriving certain conclusions from what he had seen, and I don't know. It sounds a little bit conspiratorial. It
Yeah.
sounds like too much.
I was
And I
thinking
was,
the same thing when I saw his stuff. I'm like, boy, this is kind of far-fetched and
yes,
easy to look at it as far-fetched, right? Like,
right,
no, can't, no, come on.
exactly.
You're right.
Exactly. Well, and the thing is, I don't have any doubts about the KGB having been able to concoct such a plan. But it was just, because I'm a historian, I like to look at evidence.
Mhm.
And he didn't present evidence. He had worked there, so obviously he was just kind of reflecting on what he had learned and what he had
It's a
practiced in
personal
fact.
testimony, right? Like, he's not
Yes.
bringing actual proof, which is what's hard then to believe him, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Because I am, I'm not an academic historian, but I'm tied enough to the academy. And I want to be sure to follow kind of academic rules in my own research. It's just the standard I want to follow because I think it's really important. As I say, I'm not an academic historian in the sense that I'm not at a university, I don't teach, I'm not a professor, but I'm very much part of academic circles. And so I'm committed to
Mm.
academic standards. So that was my initial thought. And I thought it would be very difficult to even write about this because there is no evidence. And then I couldn't really understand, what does it mean to demoralize a society? And he explains it, but it still didn't quite click for me. I'll tell you when I really understood it. I really understood it on October 8th,
Mm.
2023, when the Democratic Socialists of America and various campus groups came out with statements and went to rally for Hamas and started saying that this is decolonization and this is great and our society is at fault, and obviously not to mention that Israel is at fault. And as I was watching all of these demonstrations unfold, I kept thinking, this is what demoralization looks like. This is a demoralized society, a society that no longer believes in its own values, a society that no longer believes in its own good and its own mission, a society that no longer. And he says a really important part actually in his lecture, in the interview that's most popular on, has really gone viral on the internet since it got published there, is that when you demoralize a society, you really brainwash people, leading intellectuals, thought leaders, to the point where if I then come to them and show them archival evidence, historical documents, and tell them, no, this is not true. What you've been told is not true. This is real truth. You've been brainwashed. They will not believe me because they've been
Mm.
brainwashed so hard. And it's not until he says something like the big military boot kicks them in their big fat ass, excuse my language, I'm just quoting, that they
Yeah.
will understand what's real. And
Yeah.
I'm just saying this because these were the thoughts that came to me after October 7th. I was like, oh, I think this is what he had in mind. And that
Mm.
really terrified me. Aside from being terrified by what happened in Israel on October 7th, that, the failure of Western intellectuals, many, right? I'm generalizing, obviously,
Mhm.
not the entire society, but really kind of the elites, right? The elite intellectuals, a failure to distinguish between good and bad and wrong and right. I was like, okay, to me, this is what demoralization looks like.
100%. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's like, the things that I think a lot of Israelis have been shocked to see, and I know I've probably been less shocked because I've been following it for so long and paying attention, right? Because I've been actively um, trying to be aware of the tactics of our enemies and how they're trying to attack Israel. I mean, for my sake, right? But then I'm also seeing how they're attacking the U.S. in order to destroy that alliance between us,
Right.
and then in essence to downfall the big giant of Western civilization and so-called the little brother Israel, right?
Right.
And if you care about your survival, which I do, and you're into defense, you're into security, you're into policy making that is going to affect our way of life, then you'll see it, and it's been happening for many years. If you talk about, let's say, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, or how, I forget exactly how it's termed, the publication,
Yeah,
right?
exactly it. Yeah.
Being one of those documents that is very strongly impacted the Soviet anti-Semitic slant and worldview, but also a lot of European nations, and then also Arab nations, not to mention, of course, the Nazis and so on.
Right.
So, can you kind of maybe, just kind of shed some light on how far to your knowledge, does this go back? This kind of really nasty propaganda, and how do they weaponize this
Mm.
against the West?
Yeah, well, I mean, this could be
I
this is what I
know.
lecture about. Like it
Yeah.
could take 4 hours to just answer your question. But
Yeah.
well, look, some people will say, of course, that anti-Semitism, as expressed in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, is really it goes back, centuries and millennia. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion are just an exceptionally successful an exceptionally sort of summary, an exceptionally successful summary of the main kind of fears and conspiracies about Jews that had accumulated over the years.
Mm.
It's a real hybrid. It's an amalgamation of different stories and lies about Jews. And I'm just saying this for your listeners who may or may not be familiar with it, but it appeared sometime in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's attributed to the Russian secret or special services, who were at the time defending essentially the Tsarist
Mm.
security apparatus, which was at the time battling demands for liberalization in the Russian society, and they were battling also the fear of Bolshevism. And so they were tying all the threats that existed in the society at the time in the Russian Empire to Jews. And they were saying Jews are at fault. Jews are the enemy of everything that is great about our civilization and about our religion and about our system. And how are they doing it? They are doing it through control of the media and politics and money. And they introduced this idea of international Jewry, meaning that it's essentially a global conspiracy of Jews that
Mm.
wants to destroy our society. And they do something. The protocols claim to be the kind of a transcript, a protocol of a meeting between the leaders of Jews. So all the
Yeah,
leaders of
the
Jews got
cabal, you know.
the right, the cabal. And of course, as we all like to laugh at it, two Jews, five opinions. If only we could get ourselves 10, as we can see in Israel, right? If we could only get ourselves 10 leaders who agree on something that we all agree on,
Yeah.
um, but there is this sort of element of conspiracy that you can really see how it undermines a society, and I would say especially a democratic society, which the Russian Empire certainly wasn't. But if you
Mm.
introduce these elements of conspiracy into a democratic society, what it suggests there is that nothing you see is real. So there are Jews who say that they want freedom for our society, and they're fighting for democracy, and they're fighting for freedom of the press, but it's all lies. It's all
Mhm.
lies. And so once you say that, and if people take it to heart, then it's like, okay, nothing is real. I always have to look under the surface, and and then once you believe, so in other words, look, democracy really depends on a contract among its citizens, right? On a belief
Mhm.
that we are all in it together, and we subscribe to or ascribe to certain values, and we're going to be living in the society together in freedom, but also in contract with one another. And but that says, okay, if there are people in little hats, who control everything. So if you're in a democratic society, why would you even bother then to vote? Or why would you even
Mm.
bother to be engaged? Or you'll surrender your agency because you believe that somebody else is in charge of everything. You have zero agency. And I think this is one of the reasons conspiracy theory is so ruinous for democratic societies. And I just realized that I just spent all this time answering like 100s, of answering your question, but like really, I just got stuck on one point. But I
Mm.
think it's a really important point, because from here everything else flows. Um, and so the protocols, the Bolsheviks were very much overtly against the kind of anti-Semitism as expressed in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And the protocols are also important, by the way. I'll add this, that they played very much into the Nazi thinking, into Hitler's
Mhm.
thinking. So, there is a book by a well-known book by historian Norman Cohn, which is called Cohn, which is called a Warrant for Genocide. So he really describes the protocols. It's an excellent book. If people are interested, I highly recommend it. He describes the fascinating story of the protocols, and it is fascinating, and explains that the way they evolved, they acquired enormous popularity and spread very quickly in Europe and in the United States and throughout the world, in the Middle East. So why? But he says that they essentially became a warrant for the Holocaust. So it's a very pernicious myth which is currently being resurrected. Now, when the Bolsheviks came to power, They were against this kind of anti-Semitism. Lenin believed, remember, the Bolsheviks are socialists, they internationalists. Lenin used to say that this kind of anti-Semitism, which in the Russian Empire led to massive pogroms, it's a kind of it's a characteristic of reactionary societies. And we are trying to change that. And when we have socialism, there will be no more anti Semitism. It will go away together with racism and all forms of discrimination. We're going to have complete equality. And obviously, of course, things will be great for Jews as well. And for that reason, they were very much against Zionists. The Zionist movement was just taking shape then. Uh,
Mm.
and but of course, once they established the socialist Soviet Union, anti-Semitism didn't go away, and it continued. And here I'm going to skip through. You know, you have Lenin, then you have Stalin, and Stalin anti-Semitism is it's kind of it gets reborn again and intensified because of Stalin's own personality and inclinations. If you want, we can talk about that. But what I really focus on in my research is what happened after 1967. And 1967 is really important because that's the year when the Six-Day War took place and Israel won and Soviet client Arab states lost. And that produced a whole kind of explosion of a conspiratorial thinking inside the USSR, which they were given to anyway. A totalitarian society is always given to conspiratorial thinking. But here at the KGB, they just couldn't understand how it is that Israel won. They had supplied the Arab states, they trained them, they financed them, and yet the Arab states lost. And they come to believe that, well, there must be an international conspiracy that's acting against us. The US is in cahoots with Israel, clearly, which in 67 the US wasn't helping Israel. But so
Exactly.
exactly. So
Ironically.
uh, precisely, but so the Soviets go into this, they are now trying to understand. They believe there's the Zionist conspiracy, right? And they're asking themselves, how can we defeat it? It's clearly global. And this is, you already see how they're deriving or speaking in the same language as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So the protocols are talking about the international Jewry that's against our country, any country, right? You can adopt it to any country, and
Mm.
or many countries did. And here they're talking about international Zionism. So it's the international Zionism against our country, and it's against everything that's good in our world. What is good in our world? We're Marxist-Leninist empire. What's good in our world? So we are against racism and colonialism and imperialism. We're also against America. We're also against apartheid South Africa. So, so a lot of it is sort of substantively, it's, most people, I would say most people who consider themselves, from center left to center right would also say that they're against all these things. But for
Mm.
the Soviets, they're of course taking it and shifting it into a propaganda tone, and they essentially blame all of that on Zionists, and Zionists who are in cahoots with America, and they say that Zionists run America. And the people, and I'll make this final point and let you continue with steer the conversation further. But the people who actually put together this propaganda, they essentially launch a massive international propaganda. It's in print, it's through radio broadcasts, it's through working with left-wing parties in the West and elsewhere throughout the world. It's working with the third world, as it was called back then, the global South, the post-colonial world that is rising, right? This is the time when the post-colonial world is rising. And the Soviets, very intentionally, there was actually a KGB program to insert the USSR and the KGB into the non-aligned movement, into the third world. And so they are working through all these different channels. Whenever there is a conference, and they sponsor tons and tons of conferences and gatherings and symposia and youth festivals, where they would gather all these people and insert all these messages, anti-American, anti-Western, and anti-Zionist, anti-Israel messages, because it really fit their geopolitical agenda at the time. And my perspective, and you already see, and this is not just me, it's also historians who wrote during the Cold War, they noticed that the global left started speaking in this anti-Israel language, the specific form of anti-Israel language, by 1973. So within 5 years, they switch completely. And it's not just that they become critical of Israel, they're adopting this conspirological perspective of Israel and Zionism. And this is significant. And my view is that it has been just passing on this default view since then. I never thought it, and in fact, only deepened it. It just has continued creating so-called scholarship to reconfirm this view over and over again. And I think that's what we're dealing with now.
Mm. Okay, so essentially, I would say that probably part of what led to the Soviets having that worldview was that the ones leading these revolutionary movements within their country were basically Jewish. Is that a like a correct assessment there? And that you know what I'm saying, that was against the Tsars, was against what was the accepted norm, and
Well,
then did that somehow kind of as a knee jerk reaction to, well, this must be the collective whole of the Jewish world, right? Because
well,
there was also previously the pogroms and all this other stuff that had already been directed towards the Jewish community when they were much weaker, if you could put it like that.
right. Well, this is so you're talking about early 20th century, right? Why did the
Yeah.
protocols focus on Jews so much in Tsarist Russia? And I think that yes, it's complex, but because I think that it absolutely they already had issues with Jews. There were pogroms. The Tsarist regime in that at that time in the late 19th, early 20th century was very sort of extremely far right conservative in the sense that we are hyper patriotic and orthodox Christian, and they
Mm,
never went. Jews were liberated uh, in Europe, liberated in the sense that they acquired the same kind of political rights in Europe, in Western Europe, as the rest of the uh, ethnic minorities in those countries. In Russia, it never happened because
mm,
the right winger movement was so strong, like the anti-Semitic right wing part of the uh, Russian elites was so strong that they never did that. Jews lived in a Pale of Settlement, which was a territory that was limited. It was a large territory, but that's where most of the Russian Empire's Jewish population lived, and they were not, with some exceptions, they were not allowed to move beyond the boundaries of that Pale of Settlement. They were not, and even within the Pale of Settlement, it was very difficult for Jews to settle in big cities, in Kiev, etc. And the pogroms were there already. Of course, late 19th century is when millions of Russian Jews leave the Russian Empire because of the pogroms, and they come to America, which is why so many American Jews trace their heritage to the Russian Empire. And
mm,
yes, when and then there was a terrorist movement that arises, a very radical left wing movement in Russia, and there are Jews in it. And in the Bolshevik movement, there are a lot of Jews, and they are in leading positions. I want to say here something, though, that to a considerable degree, and I don't have statistics at hand because I just wasn't prepared for this, that we would talk about this. But the historians, actually, like bona fide historians, have looked at the numbers. And the thing about it is that Jews, they stuck out so much because people were not used to seeing Jews in positions of leadership.
mm,
And yes, there were Jews in that movement and at the top of that movement. But if you look at the percentage of Jews from among the Jewish population of the Russian Empire, how many of them were members of the Bolshevik movement at the time, how many of them wanted to have a socialist revolution, the percentage is truly tiny. It's really, really small. Whether you look in Poland, which I think at the time, I could be wrong, but I think at the time it was part of the Russian Empire, of certain traditional Polish territories, or in
mm,
what's today Ukraine, most Jews in those territories were engaged in Jewish politics. So Zionist, Bund, what have you. There were all kinds of Zionist movements, revisionist, labor Zionist, etc. again, the percentage of Jews that were engaged in the Bolshevik movement was tiny. And it's not surprising because the Bolsheviks were against religion and they were against Jewish nationalism. So why would Jews join that movement? The ones who joined most of the time were, people who they had issues with religion already. They probably had issues with nationalism. There may have been family issues, and so they acted in the movement not as Jews and not on behalf of the Jewish people, as the protocols would have us think. Right? They were
Mm,
acting out of their own socialist, internationalist views, and I think it's really important to understand.
for sure. So then at some point, it seems that after the so-called after the Cold War, I would say that it's ongoing, but it seems that there's been like a shift in priority where the where the some of the main focus really is on the newfound state of Israel and um, essentially propping up the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian people, right? Who up until this point, they're known as Arabs, you know.
Mhm.
As you know, pre 48, pre the state of Israel, during the British Mandate, everyone was Palestinian, including British who were born in the land of Palestine.
Yeah.
It was called at the time. And so they would get paperwork and birth certificates born in Palestine. Therefore, you're Palestinian, right? It's
Right.
not a nationality, it's just a territory that has been labeled that for centuries. And the only ones that are unwilling to accept this term are the Arabs. Yet magically, magically, right? Like overnight almost, uh, you ask any Arab in East Jerusalem or in under the PA or in Gaza, what are you? They're all going to say Palestinian. Why is that? And how does that get connected to the Soviet kind of global demonization of the Jewish people, like we were mentioning about the protocols of Zion and in other means and ways? How does that happen?
Right. So the shift to the state of Israel happens as kind of the object of hate. Already happens, I would say, partly perhaps under Stalin, because Stalin already in the late 40s, early 50s, already started attacking Jews as Zionists. There were a number of plots that there was, or a number of campaigns. There was the so-called anti-cosmopolitan campaign, and then the doctor's plot, in which Jews were accused of wanting to poison or plotting to poison Kremlin leadership. And there you have accusations of, it was
Mm,
called bourgeois nationalism, which really, when applied to Jews, it meant Zionism. Uh,
yeah.
Stalin supported the establishment of Israel, but he very quickly, it was a purely geopolitical position. He was hoping that Israel would help the USSR push the British Empire out of the Middle East. But he
Uh-huh.
changed his mind very quickly. His paranoia flared up for a number of reasons, and he really came to believe that Jews were now a fifth column inside the USSR, because now there was a state that could support them. And so
Hmm.
then Stalin dies in 1953, and then we're into the Cold War. And yes, there is the kind of traditional anti-Semitism is going. And I just remembered, I think I forgot to mention it in the previous. This is what I wanted to make. The point I wanted to make is that
Mm,
the people who create this anti-Zionist propaganda for the Soviets, they speak in the Marxist-Leninist language, but they are members essentially of the anti-Semitic Russian far right. They eventually give birth to post-Soviet neo-Nazi movement and real true
mm,
white supremacist movement, because they are reading the protocols of the elders of Zion. So the protocols are prohibited in the USSR overtly, but there are groups that are anti-Semitic, they're neo-Nazi, they're neo-fascist, they're under the ground. It's very much not allowed openly in the USSR, but they're
mm,
reading this literature, and they manage to insert themselves into the creation of this anti-Zionist campaign. And they know that they can't speak in the language of the protocols. They know that they can't speak in the language of Nazi Germany, but they essentially reinvent the language grounding it in the same ideas about Jews, but now speaking about Zionists. And so the
Mm.
connection there is very, very clear, very pretty much pretty obvious. So now going back to the question of the Palestinian national movement, this is not I'm not an expert on the Arab Middle East, and I'm not an expert on the PLO. I look at things through the lens of a historian of the USSR. I know that there are people who say, and there is a view out there, and it's actually they trace it to a Romanian intelligence officer who defected,
Hmm.
which says that the KGB is the one that Pacepa, that the KGB is the one that invented the Palestinian movement. The truth about it, I've spoken to a number of historians about it, academic historians, and this is where I go back to the idea that, historians want to see documents. So there are no documents that show that this is what the KGB has done. It's very tempting to think so. The PLO charter, their first charter of 1968, it includes language that it's just like completely Soviet propaganda language. And here I just want to say that even if we don't know 100% academically speaking, right, well, let me just also backtrack and say that, it's not only, it's complicated because we know that the KGB, and this is confirmed, that the KGB had a complicated relationship with Arafat. It didn't really trust him 100%. They thought that he was volatile and unreliable because,
I
they.
wonder why. I wonder why.
I know.
I
Well,
can't
and
see
this,
where they get that from.
well, and this is the strange thing that I think sometimes people misunderstand. I mean, if you are the KGB, it's a little bit more complex than sometimes people think. It's not black and white. There are
Yeah.
competing perspectives, and the KGB, for example, during the time of the Palestinian terrorism in the 70s, when they were hijacking airplanes, the KGB were kind of conflicted about it. They for sure they were sponsoring for sure the PFLP. They had actually a closer relationship with the PFLP than they did with the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Mm.
Than they perhaps did with the PLO in some ways.
Mm.
They definitely had someone who they had trained, a senior person in the PFLP there, so they had their person there. But they were terrified, for example, of the hijackings to be traced to them. And so, to the
Mhm.
extent that they, it's like I think that they were interested in this tool because it created a lot of chaos and destabilization, but they didn't
Mm.
want for it to be traced to them, and so they would fund the Palestinians. A lot of times, were funded via via East Germany. And Jeffrey Herf has written excellent books about this. I think something wars with Israel. I apologize, I don't remember the full name, but we
Mhm.
can write offer that title in the notes.
Yeah.
Undeclared wars with Israel is what it's called, and he writes a
Mm.
lot about the East German connection with the Palestinians. But East German, of course, means fairly automatically that the Soviets were involved as well.
Mm.
So all of that is kind of to say that even if we can't establish with 100% certainty that the USSR invented the Palestinian identity and the Palestinian liberation movement, um, it almost doesn't matter because they certainly become deeply involved with the cause. At some point, they understand that the cause serves their objectives and they help to insert it into the global left wing kind of package of causes in a very real way, not just conceptually, but they begin to introduce this cause at various left wing gatherings. They essentially turn Arafat into a celebrity in these circles in the same way as, they equate him with Che Guevara. They equate the
Mhm.
Palestinian cause with all of the most popular causes of the left at the time, which is, the anti-Vietnam War position, the Chilean Revolution cause, whatever was popular, the civil rights movement in the US, of course, the
Mhm.
anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So these are causes that were hard to argue with. And the Soviets equate the Palestinian cause with all of them. So if you had been,
So
yeah, go ahead.
would you say they tie it in like you were pointing out? And I think that's a great comparison because I'm one of the few people that I notice where I'm talking about this, and I try to explain the connection between making Che Guevara into a hero and having him on T-shirts and college campuses and so on. And that's a cool dude who's like a bloody murderer scumbag. Like, how on earth did we get here? So that's all connected, really. That's part of this Russian psyops, you know, behind closed doors, so to speak. It's not overt, it's not policy, but it's them working behind the scenes, promoting all of these and tying them together with real causes that really matter. And that way, it's hard for you to disassociate those causes with something that's negative, right? So they essentially work on people's heartstrings, then,
A
not
hun-
logic.
100%
Yeah,
heartstrings is what it is, and I want to, again, I'm always very careful here, because we're
yeah.
talking about conspiracy theory. I don't want to sound like I am a conspiracy theorist here, because this is in fact based on historical research, but
Mm.
like historical evidence, that and it's complex. So it's not like the Soviets invented. I don't know that they invented, for example, the fascination with Che Guevara. What
Hmm.
I know from the work of Christopher Andrews, who co-wrote two excellent books with another KGB defector, whose name I'm now blanking on, but like KGB defectors. Let me backtrack here for a little bit. Like, why would I believe this book, and for example, not what Pachepa wrote, and
Hmm.
not what necessarily Bezmenov said? Because when you're a KGB defector, it's like, as a historian, again, I don't know if I can trust it 100%. He may have incentives to say certain things that, but if it's a book that has been written with an academic historian, who has worked with archives, has examined the archival evidence, and Christopher Andrews has done that. That it's the Mitrokhin archives. Mitrokhin was the KGB defector who brought with him a ton of archives. Like, you could actually examine the evidence. So Andrews, as a British historian, examined the evidence and co-wrote a book with him. So in that book, he talks about this really fascinating moment when the Soviets realize that Che Guevara is extremely popular among
Hmm.
Western leftists, among American New Left. How did he become so popular? We don't know. That may not
Hmm.
have been a psyops. Who knows? The New Left was fascinated with the national liberation movements. The New Left had turned away from communism when Stalin's crimes were revealed, um, when the Soviets put down a Hungarian uprising in 1956. They turned away from communists, and so they turned their interest and fascination toward the Third World. They were known as the Third Worldists, and so so they became fascinated with Che Guevara. The Soviets actually did not consider, they did not view Che Guevara as particularly, they did not hold him in high esteem. They
Hmm.
viewed him as a brave but incompetent guerrilla. I think this is an actual quote from that book. They also thought that he was unpredictable and unreliable, and they thought that
Mm.
his grasp on theory was not that great, on Marxism Leninism. And in fact, Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, for a while, they had their own views on how revolution should be conducted. The Soviets by then become a lot more conservative, and Che
Mm.
Guevara and Castro, and by the way, the Chinese want to be going. The Soviets are now into the detente with America. They want to establish a relationship with the U.S., even as they're battling it, right,
Yeah.
in the Cold War. But these guys want, to go there, on the white horse and really revolution. The Soviets don't want it. So these guys, however, become heroes of the global left, and or
Mm.
the new left in the U.S. And so when the Soviets notice and realize it, they use it for all it's worth. And this is what they were really good at. Even this anti-Zionist propaganda that I talk about, I'm not saying that they invented all of it. A lot of other people contributed. For example, the
Hmm.
British Foreign Office already equated Zionists with Nazis, or talked about Zionists as Nazis, in the 1930s. And I think that's because in the British Mandate Palestine, the Zionists were attacking them, right? They were fighting the British Empire, they were attacking them.
Hmm.
The Nazis were also against the British. And so the British made that equation. But it's the Soviets synthesized all of it into this hybrid view and sold it to the world, and that's really the credit that they get for that. And so the same with Che Guevara. So okay, some new leftists love Che Guevara, but the Soviets then took it and sold it to everyone. And but the linking between the Palestinian cause and other causes, you literally see it in Soviet propaganda. Like if you just read it, if you read their pamphlets and their articles from that time, and if you read the articles that were republished in Western leftist publications, they 100% equate the Palestinian cause with all of these major causes: anti-Vietnam War protest, the civil rights movement, the ANC, South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, and the Chilean Revolution. It's not as well remembered now, but these causes, they do that. Like you can read Soviet propaganda from then, and you see them do it. And I think that this is a precursor to what we see now. This is like an ongoing theme in anti-Israel propaganda, where they are constantly equating the Palestinian cause with every cause of the moment in an attempt to bring it to people and help them relate to it.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, can you talk about how Mahmoud Abbas had basically been coached and raised up in some of that ideology? I know you had written quite a bit on this as well.
It's my
Like and explain the difference. I guess I'll put it like this too. Actually, explain the difference between someone like Mahmoud Abbas in having his slant and his worldview versus the, let's say, the Hamas jihadist more worldview, and how the and essentially how the Soviets, right, play in on his side, on Abbas's side, and trying to influence that part of the Arab world.
So Abbas, talking about Abbas's dissertation is like one of my favorite subjects in the whole world, because you can really see how the Soviets co-opted their academy for their purposes. Hamas appears later. I don't know, again, this is, I want to stay in my lane. I'm not an expert on Hamas.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
uh,
But it's
the
opposing views. I mean, that much you can say for sure, and or see for sure too, right?
the views are different.
Yeah,
Probably, right. Probably. I mean, certainly
yeah,
the original Palestinian movement was a secular movement. The
right.
PLO movement was secular. The jihadist movements rise later, and I want to make clear here that the once the Cold War ends, things change. Things change. So the Soviets no longer have the kind of money and energy to perpetuate this anti-Zionist propaganda, and in fact, at some point, Russia becomes a friend of Israel, and all of these, states that
Mm,
arose from the USSR, also friends of Israel, because they establish friendly relations. So we can talk about what happens after the USSR falls apart, but
hmm.
until then, this is really the story that I'm focusing on now. And so yes, so Mahmoud Abbas came to the USSR in, I believe, in the late 70s, and as already a promising member of the PLO. He was older. I think he was in his 40s already. He already had a master's degree from the University of Damascus, if I'm not mistaken. And what the Soviets had done by then, so this is about 10, 12 years after they launched this massive anti-Zionist campaign, international campaign, and become involved in the Palestinian cause, is that they designate several think tanks and several departments in several universities to kind of to be providing to be legitimizing the propaganda. So they're not telling them, let's investigate what Zionism is. You investigate what Zionism is, you study Israel, and you tell us what you find. No, it's the opposite, right? They tell them, this is what we believe about Zionism, this is what we believe about Israel. We need you to provide a justification for this perspective. This is clearly not academic, right? Because you're not allowing
Right.
freedom, for the researchers to come to their own conclusions.
Right.
Everything is being fit into this perspective, this conspirological perspective about Zionism, and Zionism is representing the greatest evil in the world.
Hmm.
So Abbas comes to a an institute that is called, he first of all he joins the Patrice Lumumba Institute, which is well known as a place where the Soviets essentially coached the future third world elites. They came there, they got their kind of basic BA education, and this is where they were inculcated with Soviet perspectives. The Soviets selected, not everybody was selected with the same kind of attention, but it was very selective. The Soviets wanted to bring in people from the third world, the developing world, who could be useful in their objective of turning the third world into their sphere of influence. And
Hmm.
so Abbas comes there, but he defends his dissertation in a different place. He defends his dissertation at the Institute of Oriental Studies, and it's just purely technical. Not every school, even in the US, can grant a PhD, but the Institute of Oriental Studies could. Patrice Lumumba couldn't. But the Institute of Oriental Studies at the time was headed by Primakov, Yevgeny Primakov, who eventually, in the post-Soviet times, became briefly a prime minister. But I believe in post, no, not in post. Anyway, don't quote me on that. At some point, he became prime minister. I think at
Hmm.
post times, but he was a very respected scholar. He was an Arabist. He knew the Arab world very well, but he was also deeply involved in the Soviet intelligence. Deeply. And so it's not accidental that Abbas was brought into that institute. uh, Primakov would have known exactly where he's coming from and what the objectives are of his getting a PhD there. And and that institute was one of the central places where anti-Israel propaganda was produced, legitimized. They produced tons and tons of literature, scholarly books, and scholarly articles. And the people who worked there were just, I mean, just terrible. The institute itself just recently, actually, a few years ago, reviewed that episode in its existence. The institute is still there, and they acknowledge that this was a terrible period where they served propaganda, and they themselves explain how they were used for propaganda purposes. So anyway,
Hmm.
Abbas comes there, and he produces a dissertation that's called. It essentially equates. It talks about Zionist and Nazi collaboration in World War II, and not just collaboration, but collaboration in the Holocaust. And this is important. I mean, most of what's been written about the dissertation uh, says that it was about him denying the Holocaust. This is mostly what people have focused on. But actually, the main point there is not even that. The main point, I don't even think he denies the Holocaust. He diminishes the significance of the Holocaust. But the main point of that dissertation is to say that Zionists are as bad as the Nazis, and they participated in the annihilation of Jews during the Holocaust. The reason I know that he didn't come up with this idea himself is because he defends his dissertation in 1982. The Soviets by then are churning out products with this idea, books and articles with this idea for over a decade. For over a decade, they're saying this. And so he is just borrowing that idea from them. Some of the people who are producing this literature are extremely anti-Semitic, literally. Like we don't even need
Hmm.
the Holocaust, the IRA definition of the Holocaust, contemporary definition of the Holocaust to go. It's like contemporary definition of anti-Semitism to understand that they're purely anti-Semitic, and this is who he references in his dissertation. Uh, he also, when you look at how he creates his references, when you look at the footnotes, this is going to sound like really arcane and boring, but this is what people like me do with great enthusiasm. When you follow what he references, you actually see how he decontextualizes certain quotes that he uses, rips it out of context, sometimes completely reverses the meaning, the original meaning of the author that he's quoting. So when you look at his references, it looks like, wow, okay, he's quoting some really excellent people. In addition to anti Semites, he's quoting some excellent people. He clearly has read Herzl himself, he's quoting Hannah Arendt. But when you look at this source material, you can see that it's completely distorted. And so this is not really a dissertation. Again, it's a dissertation, which, by the way, is tiny in size. It's written in beautiful, perfect Russian, which makes me ask who really wrote it, because he doesn't speak Russian. He certainly doesn't write Russian. And it's a work of propaganda, is what it is. And then I understand that he turned this dissertation into a book, and he added some other things in the book that are not in the dissertation. But the question is, why did the Soviets need it, right? Why did they sort of put the entire reputation of the Academy of Sciences on the line by sponsoring this dissertation? And by the way, I should say that the people who were his advisors, they didn't know anything. There is nothing in their background that shows that they understand Israel, that they understand the Holocaust, that they understand the Nazi movement. So this is all just a big show. So why are they doing it? And they're doing it for the same reason that they are putting out all of the propaganda. They want to show, but now with a twist, they want to show that, well, it's not just we who are saying it. Here is this leader of the National Liberation Movement of the Palestinian people who came and defended his dissertation, and he thinks the way we do. And this is an academic work, and so we can trust it. And this is part of the ecosystem that they're building. There are there are Soviet books where they translate foreign authors, foreign leftists who are talking about Zionism in the same terms, and they're saying, look at all these progressive authors who are saying the same thing that we do, except that they are actually the ones who gave these progressive authors, Americans, the British, the Finns, who gave them these ideas, who paid for them to come to Moscow and learn from them, sponsored their publications. And so now they're saying, oh, look, they're saying the same thing that we're doing independently. There's nothing independent about it. It's an echo chamber, it's a circular referencing kind of system. And by the way, a lot of people on the left today are doing exactly the same.
It's so crazy. That is so crazy.
Yeah.
Um, so, like in the United States, Europe, I think as well, but I've mostly noticed in the U.S. there's this infatuation with Marxism, with communist ideas. Um, is this part of? Would you say this is part of these? You know, I guess you could say that the Russia's attempt to basically pump into campuses and so on purposely, and has been doing for years, to pump in these ideas to get America, and especially on the far left, to embrace these ideas and to make them like I guess like you're saying, like, oh look, they're just like us, right? They're, we're all, uh you know you should have even had the Cold War, because see, we're all on the same page here. But really, after years of destroying, like I was saying earlier, right, the family structure, coming against the Christian values and worldviews that America is founded on, that of course, again, Russia, like you point out, also has a traditional Christian worldview, but the way they interpret that is in different political streams. So why all of a sudden we're seeing this infatuation, would you say, in America and on these college campuses?
Well, look, I don't think it's new. I just think that it has come to the forefront
Hmm.
because I think it's always been there, just like this anti Israel propaganda has always been on the margins of the left. But now, because we have such polarization, these radical ideologies have come into the mainstream. And so I want to also, like, now return to the idea that Russia today is a little bit different. So Russia today itself is not Marxist Leninist. And so,
Right.
right, Russia, when they say that Putin wants to recreate the USSR, it's not literal. I think it's correct in some ways. I think he wants to recreate the empire, and he wants
Hmm.
to recreate the greatness that he believes the USSR possessed under Stalin. I don't think I know for sure. I mean, I'm pretty sure he doesn't want to go back to communism.
Right.
Um, he's a capitalist. He loves money. So,
Well,
so
apparently the richest man in the world, right?
I, possibly, we don't know,
He's up
but
there.
yes,
He's up
very,
there.
very, 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 very rich. So, to
Yeah.
the extent that Russia is influential today on American campuses, and it probably is, it's I think the objective is different. I think, well, it's the same in the sense that let's create chaos, let's create divisions. Also, Russia now, during the USSR, it was ideological in the sense that we want the whole world to be Marxist Leninist because this is what we believe in. Today it's different. Today it's like we know how destructive these ideologies are, so let us pump them into the West so that they
Mm,
can, be poisoned with that. They
mhm,
certainly understand it very, very well, the destructive power of these ideologies. I think the KGB, to be honest with you, understood it even already in the late 70s and 80s. And there is this, I don't know if it's real or if it's just a joke. I think it's real that the KGB actually understood that by the 1980s, the only true believers in Marxism, Leninism, and communism were in the West. They knew that inside the USSR, you know, nobody believed it anymore. I mean, I was growing up at the time, certainly in the educated spheres, nobody believed it. It was extremely cynical.
mhm,
But in the West, that's where all the believers were. So I think that my view, and I don't know it 100%. I think this is something we need to study. We need to understand who is really influencing our university campuses, and it will take multiple scholars to understand it. I think
mhm,
we can probably be sure that Iran is doing it, right? Qatar is doing it. Uh,
mhm.
Certainly, the anti-Semitic ideologies, that anti-Israel ideologies that they're pumping in come from there. We know China is trying to do it. China is probably churning out Marxist-Leninist ideology,
Mhm.
but again, not necessarily
Which
because they.
ironically, China is also post those ideologies and knowing how destructive it was and not
Yes,
wanting to go back. So I would say China and Russia are in a way kind of coming from kind of the same angle. Like
yes,
we've been there, we done that, don't
yes,
work.
yes,
and
yes,
these bright-eyed Americans who how would you say they have this fantasy idea of
right, right,
these ideals and oh it just wasn't implemented good enough in
right,
Russia or China. uh,
exactly,
we'll make it great in America, right?
right, exactly,
Their
exactly, and this.
version of make America great again.
Yes,
uh,
exactly, and it's anti-capitalist. You know how they always it's always the far left groups, right? That talk about they're against Israel, they're against Zionism, they're also against America, against capitalism. Certainly, none of these countries want to go to anti-capitalism. But yeah,
yeah.
it's very naive. But I think to a
Yeah.
considerable degree, it really got planted in the West among the Western academic elites already during the Cold War. There's some fascinating literature
Mm,
about how the Soviets really courted Western intelligentsia from the very beginning, from the 1920s all the way into the 80s,
mm,
bringing them on tours. Bernie Sanders went on a tour like this. Try like
mhm.
Western influencers, but especially intelligentsia, bringing them in, showing them the Potemkin village of, this is how it works, and we're so great, and you should want the same. And
Yeah.
there are amazing books exploring why the intelligentsia, people with the PhDs, turned out to be so silly and such easy marks for this kind of horrible propaganda. They would go
Yeah.
to China and Cuba. These ideas just have been part of the academy for a long time, getting
Mm,
passed on over and over again, because it doesn't just, these ideologies don't just take over accidentally or suddenly. A lot of work was put into it. And but certainly there are people today who are working to inflame that. And when I say people, I mean state actors that are trying to inflame it. And I think it's all of the above. It's everybody that we mentioned. I think that Russia's influence I think is diminished today compared to the USSR significantly. They just don't have the same kind of money. They don't have the same kind of reach, but it's not to be discounted. And I'll add one more thing is that today, if we're talking specifically about Russia, it's very omnivorous in terms of who it's trying to influence. So during the Cold War, it primarily targeted the far left and the third countries, the left in the third countries, and today it doesn't matter to it. It's willing to speak to anyone who will be willing to create chaos. Chaos agents. I mean, it's almost a cliche in these kinds of
Mm.
conversations, but it's true. uh, Agents of chaos and division. So they could be on the right. And I think that, people that you were mentioning early on, Candace Owens and um,
Tucker
what
Carlson
Tucker
and
Carlson,
yeah,
exactly.
all these guys.
Yes,
Yeah, that was like a weird piece he did when he visited Russia, right? Like
extremely bizarre.
that really blew me away because I'm like, look,
Yeah,
I thought we were on the same page here, Tucker. I thought we
right,
were pro-American,
right,
pro-religious, Judeo-Christian values.
right,
Him being Christian, and very proudly so, and
right,
whatnot, and his Christian values are so important.
right.
And I'm like, why are you prompting up Russia like some kind of amazing country
Yes.
because they have cheaper a Russian version of McDonald's, and it tastes the same.
Yeah,
Wow.
right,
That's something to be proud of.
right.
You know what I mean?
Well, and
Or
also
or or,
cheap.
or like their shopping stores,
Right,
the equivalent to Walmart.
right.
And then I have a good friend who's actually a war correspondent that I actually asked because I was so baffled. I was like, "Can you tell me what this guy's doing?" You
Right.
know, and he goes, "Well, to be honest," he says, "I don't think he told me what the angle was, but he was saying, here's the deal." He says, I know that very same place he went to. It does not look like that on the everyday. That was a staged propaganda tour. And
Right,
it reminded me of Dennis Rodman, right? Who visited North Korea and came back with the same kind of story of like,
right,
it's a great place.
right.
We just need to make friends with these people. And
Exactly.
they share the exact same views as we do.
Right.
Um, like what on earth? I mean,
Exactly. And for me, as a former Soviet citizen and a Russia scholar, it was
yeah,
just truly, I just wanted to hit my head against the wall because,
right.
here's what's funny. Remember how he goes into this metro station, this
Yeah,
really
yeah.
the thing about it is that this metro station, this very specific metro station, has been an obligatory stop on every Potemkin Village tour. And when I say Potemkin Village, for those of you listeners who don't know, it's like it's a stage tour, right? To show
Yeah.
that how great everything is, when in reality, you just look behind the scenes a little bit and you see just how horrible everything is in reality. So
Mhm.
Bernie Sanders, when he went to the US to the USSR in 1987, went to the same station. They
Oh my
bring Tucker
lord. It's like
Carlson
a
to the
repeat of a tour, and these guys don't even see it.
totally, exactly. And it's like really, and then the interview with Putin when he gives him what at like 28 minutes spiel about his historical perspective, it's just such BS. And if you
Yeah,
but
yeah,
if you don't know this, if you don't know what he's saying, why he's saying it. If you don't know Russian history, really, you can't tell what it is, how he's manipulating the history, what he's trying to do. It was a complete manipulation, and so in that sense, and I can't even remember why and how we started this. Oh, right, that Russia is not ideological.
yeah.
Wherever it sees people who are open to its ideas, it will go there and it will direct it to those groups. Like I've met people on the right who have said to me that they have been considering, and this is before Trump was elected, when it was like a peak woke, right? So a
Mm.
couple years ago. So where they were saying, well, I'm thinking of moving my family to Russia because
Oh,
the woke is so horrible in America. Where do we go? Where do we educate our children? And I was like, no, 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 don't do it. Don't, no. I mean, I understand. I'm also against woke, but don't take your children to Russia. It's
yeah.
crazy.
Wow.
So yeah, yeah. So
The
it
fact that
worked.
people would consider this from you're saying these are conservatives
Right, right.
is beyond me.
Yes.
Back in the mid '90s, I visited what is it, Leningrad, yeah,
Hmm.
or
Oh, St. Petersburg, probably. St.
St.
Petersburg.
Petersburg, right?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
so formerly Leningrad,
Right.
right? St. Petersburg, and I remember we actually went to be like help at a youth camp thing, right? For the workers who work at the factories, they have like a youth village, if you like, for the children throughout the summer vacation.
Hmm.
And so we were helping with the being counselors there and all this stuff, and it was like a fun experience for me as an Israeli, connecting with with another culture and everything. And I would say my experience there was the real Russia, like the real people, the real food that they eat, what have
Right.
you.
Right.
But then we took a train to go into St. Petersburg, into downtown, and I will never forget. Like, first of all, the train ride, when I was driving down on the train, I remember seeing some houses other than the camp we were at, right? For the first time, you see how people live. And there were wooden slats for walls that even had gaps in them. And I thought to myself, a place like this with a winter like they have in this
Right.
part of the world,
Right.
how do these people survive?
Right.
You know? And then the train, I remember thinking, as an Israeli, right? Because I thought, oh, this is Russia. And, I come from Israel. This is great Russia. And I remember the seats of the train were like hard wooden benches, and I just felt like I was in a third world movie
Yes.
kind of scene.
Yes.
And then before I know it, I'm downtown St. Petersburg, and it's like, whoa,
Yes.
like what a different world. Like this
Right.
looks like a modern European city, and everybody, more modern looking and whatever.
Yes. Exactly.
And then the food, of course, was much more advanced, if you like, whatnot.
Yeah.
And it's like I just thought, if people were to visit St. Petersburg, visit, I don't know, Moscow, like the main central cities, they think, oh, this is Russia, but they don't really go out into, where Russians actually live and how life
Precisely.
truly is, and how
Precisely.
you're waiting in line to just get kvass into a bottle off the back of a truck. Yeah, right. I
Thank
mean,
you for that tidbit. Thank you for that tidbit. I love that tidbit about class.
right, you know what I mean. and
Yes.
and and to me, it's like people don't get to see that. They don't get to see the real
Right.
Russia.
Right.
They think they know what Russia is because they visit, right, these centers that are
Right.
in a way protected, so to speak, so that that it saves face for Russia,
Yes.
right? But like
Yes.
another thing that was shocking to me, we visited the camp. I think was called Camp Pilot or something like that, because it
Mm-hmm.
was next to an Air Force base.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a
Pilot. Mm-hmm.
Pilot, if I
Mm-hmm.
remember correctly, and so
Mm-hmm.
we went to go visit the Air Force base, and these dudes were wearing tank tops with military fatigues. So they weren't even wearing full uniform, and they were sloppy looking. There wasn't any discipline going on there. And I remember seeing Russian MiGs on the tarmac with the tires punctured
Mm-hmm.
and rust on the plane. I mean, I was like,
Yeah.
is this Russia? Like this is, you know what I mean? It
Yep.
kind of like just kind of shattered my view of the great superpower Russia.
Right.
And I thought, this must be a joke. This must be like a backwater part of Russia. This can't be how people live. It can't be how the might of Russia is. But sure enough, I keep hearing more and more stories that no, 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 that's exactly how it is.
Right.
They're using outdated technology because they don't have actual money to create the new, updated war machines, planes,
Right.
aircraft carriers, whatever. If you want to equivalent it to the United States and China, they're not there,
Right.
right? And it's
Right.
almost like they're kind of hiding. They're kind of hiding that rust in buckets of the dead past of what what communism led to, right?
Right.
And it's like they're in essentially trying to dig themselves out of that, but portray to the world something completely different.
Right.
I mean,
Well,
you can correct me if I'm wrong on all those assessments, but that's, as a young teenager, that's what I walked away with, being
well,
shocked to.
and look, I mean, so you went in the 90s, right? You said.
Yes. Yeah, it was like 95, 96, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, you could say things have certainly changed since then. Now, I haven't been in Russia in the last, I think in the last decade, I would say, but until then I went pretty regularly, and I'm constantly, because of the work that I do, I interact with Russians all the time, so I know people a lot of people. But now all of them, all of the people that I knew have also been pushed out of Russia. I mean, look, Russia in the after after the 1990s, that was a really difficult decade. Um, Certainly, so much investment, a lot of investment was made into the cities, and your assessment is completely correct, and this has never changed. In that these main two cities that are viewed the two capitals, Moscow and Leningrad or St. Petersburg,
Yeah.
they remain these central cities that are meant to show the beauty of Russia, and they project the power, and people started living there. People always lived better in those two cities, especially in Moscow.
Hmm.
And certainly, I think that the gap only grew, I would say, in the 2 decades since the 1990s. And really, at some point, Moscow felt like you could come to Moscow, and if you just stayed within a certain territory, within a certain kind of boundary in the center, and were only interacting, let's say, with, like, in my case, it would be, journalists and like liberal intelligentsia and all that, and you feel like you're living in the West, great
Mm.
life, great cafes, really creative, parks, biking paths, etc., all beautiful. But yeah, as soon as you venture outside of that, you don't even have to leave Moscow. You just go to the periphery of Moscow, and life is already different. And then
Mm.
go to Siberia, which is where I grew up. And I
Yeah.
went to, I think the last time I went was 2015. I went to visit my relatives there, and oh my God, it's just despair. And but today, today a lot of the people who were against Putin's regime have been pushed out of the country. And so what you have is, let's say you align with Putin's ideology on certain values. Let's say you think that it represents conservative values really well, and you appreciate the fact that it speaks to religious values and conservatism, etc. Even though I think that it's all manipulative. But even if you accept that, if you are someone who believes in democracy, you're going to go into that society and live there. I'm going back to the idea of people who said that they might want to move their family there. you know People are living in a bubble, information bubble. You're only allowed to hear information that comes from state propaganda media. You say something even accidentally that contradicts the propaganda, you already may be in danger, even though if you're a foreigner, maybe you're a little bit privileged and you have a little bit more freedom. But it's just not where you
Yeah.
learn how to live in a democratic society. And I also find that a lot of times people don't understand, both, by the way, on the left and on the right. This is like there are factions on both sides where they are weirdly pro Russia, and they will tell you, well, Putin was elected by the vast majority of people. And it's like, really? Do you understand what kind of elections these were? Or they will say, well, in the occupied Ukrainian territories, there were referenda, and most people voted for Russia or for Putin. Like, seriously? They voted under the guns. They voted when millions of other people had fled those territories. You consider this a good election? Like, you consider this fair election? So there's
Mm.
so much misunderstand, so much perhaps willful lack of understanding of what Russia is like today, and some
Mm.
of it perhaps sincere. People just don't have good information. But yeah, there's a lot of that.
Yeah. Wow. So I'm just thinking, as we kind of help people get an understanding a little bit about how Russia has been trying to influence the world, if it's America, if it's here in Israel. Um, what would you say, kind of like in some like some summarizing thoughts, so to speak, right? What would you say about the current conflict with Ukraine and how that has played into the October 7th attacks? And was Russia at all behind some of that? And is that just some conspiracy theorist kind of ideas? Is there some truth to it? Because I know, at least for me, being in the fighting, I know we had a lot of chatter amongst ourselves that we could hear quite a bit of Russian chatter on the from the Hamas terrorists, right? Like within the chatter, within their radio chatter, there
Mm,
was some talks about that,
mm.
and then again there was different. Some said, "Oh, it's because of this. Oh, it's because that." So I'm kind of like, I don't know, but maybe you might have some insights into that and how that plays into that.
Well, look, I can't say that I have any insights because I just don't know. I don't think that we have proof. There's
Mm.
conversation about that. I'm not inclined to think that Russia knew about the attack or somehow participated in it. I'm really
Assisted or anything? Yeah,
I don't know. I would be surprised if that happened. But Russia certainly
yeah.
has relationships with all of these Palestinian factions. It has a relationship. Obviously, we talked about an ongoing relationship with Abbas and the PLO. They clearly have a relationship with Hamas and PFLP, right? They all
Mm.
of these different leaders of all these Palestinian groups, terrorist groups, have been to Russia since before October 7th and then after October 7th. We know that Hamas, in its very first public statements and interviews after October 7th, its senior leaders were thanking Russia for supporting Hamas. So, so, so you know,
Right.
so so there is a relationship. There is definitely some kind of a connection. I think we need to understand it. What happened, I think, during also that's worthy of note after October 7th is that for Russia, it was a very useful moment. For Russia
Right.
at that point in 2023 was really deeply isolated internationally as a result of its attack on
Right.
Ukraine, right? Its full scale invasion of Ukraine began in February of 22. So this is a year and a half later. And Putin sees this as an opportunity to exit that international isolation. He understands immediately that things have shifted and he has opportunities because Russia has a relationship with Iran. Russia has a relationship with all the Arab states. And by the way, in the Arab countries, as well as many countries in Africa that have a memory of that old Soviet relationship with the USSR, note that those countries did not condemn Russia's attack on Ukraine. They didn't
Mm.
join the kind of this Western alliance,
Right.
right? The anti-Russian
They
Western.
didn't have hashtag Ukraine on their
Exactly.
social media outlets.
No, they did not.
Yeah.
And so the relationship is there by virtue of that Cold War alliance that lasted
Mm.
for many decades. And so it opened the door for Putin to again become relevant and for Russia to become relevant again. And so I think in that sense, for sure, they took advantage of that moment. Until then, Russia had a very it had a relationship with Israel. I wrote a lot, not, I wrote quite a bit on how Israelis shouldn't trust that alliance fully and shouldn't consider Putin to be a true ally. It was
Mm.
really a meeting of it was useful for Putin geopolitically then, and then the geopolitics shifted and he took the Palestinian side.
Mm.
So yeah, just to summarize, I don't think I'm not prepared to say that Russia was involved in October 7th, but it certainly
Hmm.
used it to its advantage. There's no doubt about that.
Hmm. Right. But one thing we can say for sure is they're not pro Islamists. They just use them as their useful idiots, I would say, as far as their alliances. Is that a good way to put it? Because I there does seem to be this green red alliance, so to speak, right, of these communist nations or formerly communist nations with Muslim nations, and as you pointed out, Russia and Iran and so on, right? Um, but I wouldn't say it's because of ideological reasons. It would be, if anything, it's because your enemy is my enemy, and therefore you're my friend. Meaning, right, the
I
United States and Israel, right?
I would say that that's true. I would just add one more complication here, and when you're a historian, you always try to avoid you always try to complicate things, to
Right.
complicate the stories that we tell. Russia has pretty significant Muslim population. And so I think that
Hmm.
some of it may also be driven by considerations of internal loyalty and the kind of internal perhaps internal demand from those quarters to stand against Israel and with the Palestinians. So I think that that probably plays into it. But yes, certainly Russia also, again, a complicating factor. Russia also itself experiences terrorism by
Mm.
Islamist groups, extremist groups. So it's complicated. And again, Russia has always insisted on reserving the right to be able to speak to everyone. Look, during the Cold War, one thing that sometimes people don't really understand is that Russia actually never said through its diplomatic channels, even as it was supporting the Palestinian cause and promoting it, even as it was, helping East Germany, which was supplying money to the Palestinian terrorists who had the genocidal agenda against Jews in Israel, and obviously the Arab states that had also an annihilationist agenda vis-a-vis Israel during the Cold War. Even as the USSR was doing all of that, it never said openly that it supported the annihilation of Israel. And in fact, it insisted on saying through diplomatic channels, in diplomatic fora, that it believes in Israel's right to exist and solutions need to be found that accommodate both Israelis and Palestinians. And in fact, it coached the Palestinians, it coached the PLO and Arafat to not say that they seek an elimination of Israel because they thought it's just not a good look. So you so
Not
you
good
see,
for PR.
not good for PR. So you see, like when you
Yeah.
are an authoritarian superpower, nobody can make you be consistent. You don't have to be consistent in your policies. You can support different policies for different purposes. And I think that this is what Russia is doing today. It insists on being able to talk to every agent or every group or actor in the Middle East and everywhere else. And just because it does one thing doesn't mean that it has to be consistent. It likes to have whatever, like to have its hand in different situations so that it can manipulate them for its own purposes.
Hmm. Yeah. Keep it fluid and
Yeah.
use it for your own overarching agenda.
Yeah.
Which I think really the bottom line is then, for people to try and understand these contradictions, right? Is that ultimately Russia is trying to gain the superpower of the world position up against China and the United States,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And
It
that's really what kind of I would explain some of the contradictions also both of the United States and China in the way they act with foreign policy and wars that they fight.
Right.
Or I guess China hasn't been fighting any wars that we are aware of on paper, right?
Right.
But I'm sure they're very much involved with a lot of the chaos that's going on in different parts of the world, and that
Yes.
would be for another podcast.
Right.
But
Yes.
essentially, that's kind of explaining, right? Because ultimately, they're all three of them are doing things that just don't make sense a lot of times.
Right. Well, it's very true, and you know, uh, in my view, so much anti-Western propaganda was already created during the Cold War, again, courtesy the USSR, that you don't
Mm.
really need to even be reinventing anything. It's like everything is already there in black and white, written up, produced. So any actor can take that propaganda, like Iran can take it or China can take it, purely pragmatically, right? And deploy it, not because they internally believe in these things. China may want to be working with the US on something, but at the same time, it will be pumping this propaganda in. So much has been already produced that you don't even have to be particularly inventive. You don't have to have the kind of massive military grade propaganda apparatus that the USSR had during the Cold War. It's already there, and it's already, Russia is very much involved in Latin America, together with Iran, for example, undermining the pro Western sentiments there in certain countries, certainly in Venezuela. And again, they're using something that is already there, right? It's since the Cold War. There are many complicated factors, but there is already a part of the public sentiment that's anti-Western, anti-American. And so all they need to do, just like what they did with Che Guevara and the New Left, just fire it up a little bit, give them a little bit more reasons to inflame these sentiments, and then you're already winning. And it doesn't today, it doesn't even cost, it costs a fraction of the money today because of the internet, of social media, etc. So
Hmm.
they're playing in that space along with everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Isabella, thank you so much for this very insightful interview.
Thank you
I
for
think
having me. Thank you so much.
I think your insights on the propaganda that has been influenced by these decades old documents and where they come from and the origins are very helpful for us to be able to understand what's happening today, to understand why there's um, again a huge influx of anti-Semitism in the West that I would say it is largely influenced by these decades old how would you say not just the documentation, right? But it's like a lie that if, as they say, if you repeat it enough times, right, then
Exactly.
people will believe it. And
Exactly.
that's literally what I saw with Dan Bilzerian, for example, as being I would say the most ironically, right, Andrew Tate being a Muslim, and Dan Bilzerian, I think I don't even know what he calls himself as far as faith wise,
Mm.
but it's actually the Muslim guy who has more polite way of how he slams Israel than Dan does, right? And
Yeah.
I could just tell like what it's almost like he's reading from the script of this propaganda stuff, like
Mm.
word for word, and
Mm.
make it into, this is fact, right?
Yeah.
Anybody who knows this, right?
Yeah.
I'm just bold enough to say it. I'm just, fearless enough to say it. I'm like,
Right.
no, you're a coward. And
Right.
because of the controversy, you're going to get more likes, more views,
Right.
more what have you.
Well,
And I think it's important that when people hear stuff that he's saying and others, because as we mentioned, there are plenty that are saying things, and they're all coming from different area backgrounds
right.
and different, and I think understanding the roots and the origins of this, which is some of what we touched on here, it definitely sheds light on where this stuff is coming from. This is not something new. This is not
Yeah.
something that somebody's clever enough to just kind of,
Yeah.
oh, I just happened to notice that this is what the Jews are all guilty of. It's
Right.
like, no, no, no,
Right.
no. This is, decades old propaganda. You're just reviving, really.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And I'll just add that uh I'm always careful to say, like, people, when I talk about these things, people say, "Oh, so the Soviets did all of this," and I say, "Well, look, there were other influences as well. So I'm
Sure.
just telling one part of the story. So there were, of
Well, the
course,
document started in France, I believe, even.
well, the protocols of the
Yeah, for example, if we're talking about the protocols, right? I mean,
well,
so it
yes,
wasn't actually solely Russia. It was
right.
actually Russia that revived it, if I understand correctly, because it already originated in the 1800s,
Right, and synthesized
right?
it. That's the thing. This is what
Yeah.
they did really so well during the Cold War in the 60s and 70s, is that they synthesize things in a way that serves
Mm,
their interest. And I think you said something really important, is that today a lot of people who are using this anti-Israel conspirological rhetoric are
mm,
doing it really for engagement, because they know that this language will bring them more followers. And the thing about it that's really interesting, and I know you were trying to wrap up, but I feel like I really want to make this point, is that, people on the far left, the anti-Israel far left, is always
mm.
saying, well, we're just anti-Zionist, we're not anti-Semitic. The
Exactly.
neo-Nazi far right doesn't need to make these disclaimers, because they were always anti-Zionist too, by the way. They feared Zionism early on as much as they feared Jews. So when they hear the left saying all these things about Zionism, they're like, right on, go bring this
Hmm.
language into the mainstream, because they were pushed out of the mainstream, of course, after World War II and the Holocaust,
Yeah.
so with their racist anti-Semitic language, they're looking at the far left. They're like, oh, great, sure, we'll talk about Zionism too. Zionism is horrible, So this language has become politically acceptable, and it is now uniting the far left, the socialists and the communists, with the neo-Nazi far right and the real
Yeah.
like Ku Klux Klan white supremacists, and
Exactly.
also and the Islamists. And this is what makes this language so dangerous, so addictive for those who are looking for kind of more likes on Twitter, and also
Mm.
so dangerous. So that's
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And that's also why I'm highlighting Dan in specific, not because I think he's um, I mean, to me, he's an absolute moron, right? You know, it's like it's almost not even worth mentioning this guy, but
So yeah, I just want to
it's the
say, I
fact that
don't.
he has such a big following,
Yeah,
and the fact that he is the most outspokenly anti-Semitic, right? He doesn't even color it like you said, because what I'm used to is the anti-Zion. No, we're just anti-Zion. Yeah,
right.
like a lot of these Arabs, right, who who
Mm,
are who are terrorists will say, no, we're not anti-Jewish. We're just anti-Zion, right?
right,
That's why we'll have Neto Kauta visiting in Iran and whatever, right? And
right,
look, see, we're not anti-Jewish,
right,
but he literally will say, he goes, what he I'm paraphrasing and I'm butchering what he's saying because I can't talk that dumb, but what he's basically saying is, oh, I'm just saying that if the shoe fits, right? I'm just highlighting, I'm just noticing
mm,
that if the Jews are involved here and here and here and here, well,
mm,
they must be involved in all this stuff, right?
right,
And
right,
he's like I'm just putting it out there, right?
right.
And he's like, but
I'm
I
just
have
asking
Jewish friends.
questions.
Oh, but I do have Jewish friends,
Right,
and so it's like, so he's like, so I wouldn't say I'm against all the Jews, but I am just saying at the same time Jews are a problem.
right,
It's like, which is it? You know what I mean?
right,
And
right.
it just, I was like, man, this guy, and the fact that people give him a platform to say this stuff is what I find it troubling. That's the
Yes,
thing. Is
yes,
he would be no one if people would treat him the way I do. I don't
right,
follow the guy. I
right,
don't. I'm not interested in his pictures with girls in bikinis.
right,
I could care less about the guy, but he keeps getting shoved into my face
right,
by people on the right,
right.
people on the left, and everyone in between.
Yeah,
And because like you were saying, because it they know it gets attention and it gets
yes,
social media following and viewership,
yeah,
and there's a monetary reasoning behind it, whatever.
yes,
But I'm like, just the fact that it's like saying, what if you were to have Hitler on your podcast? Is
right.
what I'm asking.
Well,
Would
and
you let Hitler go off on these rants? Because that's what this guy's saying, is things that, in my opinion, are borderline worse than Hitler in some cases, even. And
well,
that troubles me. That in
and
today's day and age, that's allowed. Yeah.
well, and I'll add this. I actually don't follow this guy. I know the name. I don't read him. There's only this so many anti-Semitic
Yeah.
conspiracy theories that I can take on my timeline. But the the thing about it is, if you want to be a free speech, freedom of speech absolutist, which
Hmm.
okay, fine, I respect. I also, coming from the USSR, I'm very much. It's one of my values, freedom of speech. And so I don't like banning things unnecessarily. But what we
Mm.
have here is that there are these massive accounts, massive, that promote
Yeah.
anti Semitic conspiracy theory. There is nothing matching that, saying the opposite. There is nobody. I don't think that there are any accounts that match them in terms of reach, that
Right.
successfully oppose this. And so I think one way to fight this kind of speech is to be educating people and to be explaining to them what is wrong with this approach, right? With this perspective, with conspiracy theory. And
Yeah.
we as a society are doing a terrible job of it. It's not done in universities, it's not done in schools. The media are doing a terrible job because they will go to anybody for commentary about anti-Semitism, except actual scholars, except people who can
Yeah.
actually give you an actual perspective. And so
Hmm.
what you have is the dominance, the flood of this kind of anti-Semitic speech, with nothing or with very little countering it as successfully.
Yeah.
And that's what I find problematic.
100%. That's exactly that's exactly what's, the underlying issue here, right?
Yeah.
Is that there's complete silence from hearing from the real people, from opposing it, right? It's
Right.
just an echo chamber of their own opinion, their own people
Yeah.
regurgitating anti-Semitic rhetoric that is just, it turns my stomach to watch,
Yeah.
because my father was a World War II vet. He actually lied about his age. He joined at 15 because he saw what Nazi Germany specifically was doing towards Jews, and he saw it as his mission to stand up against that evil.
Yeah.
And I'm just saying, a generation, being the son of one of the generation of those who literally stood up against evil. That was the generation that said, not on our watch. And here we are, what, 80 years later,
Right.
and it's like now it's legitimized to talk like that again, and
Right.
to use this rhetoric. And on my platform, I will do exactly the opposite, and I will fight against that evil. We will expose it and shine a very bright light onto that, so that hopefully people who are at least watching this podcast and watching and reading what you have to write and talk about are going to be exposed to these agendas that are nothing new under the sun, right?
Right.
like Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun, and that's what these folks are. They act like they're original. That's the irony, or
Right.
the laughable thing to me. It's like I almost laugh when I see these guys acting like they're original, thought thinkers and have their own kind of original ideas. It's like, bro,
Right.
you're as old as a broken record.
Exactly, exactly. So it's so good
Uh,
to be a guest
yeah.
here, and we can
Yes.
fight this together. We'll do our best, right?
Yes.
As much as we can. So
Well, Isabella, thank you again so much. We're going to have all your social media links onto this podcast. Folks,
wonderful.
I hope if you enjoyed this podcast, you enjoyed this particular interview, make sure to share this, get it out to as many people as you know. Because again, if you're not going to share this kind of information, people aren't going to see it. Social media doesn't have a tendency to want to highlight truth these days. They like to highlight these folks that like to live a flashy lifestyle, something that you can't attain really unless you're part of the elite, and those who somehow magically can run around with fancy clothes and gear and watches and all this junk that they try to like tantalize people with. Those are fake people. We're real people. We have real research, real insights into real life issues. And that's what you heard here today. So if you enjoyed that and you believe in that, share it, get it out there. Follow Izabella on social media. She has a wealth of knowledge on these issues as well, of course. And thank you again for listening, and shalom from Israel.
Thank you.